Hello and welcome to Lucy K Crochet. Today I'm going to talk to you about my 20 do's and don'ts of crochet blankets. Now this list is mostly aimed at beginners to crochet, but hopefully there'll be some things thrown in there that are useful to you experienced blanket creators among us. I really love crocheting blankets. I've been doing it for a very long time. They were one of the first things I learned how to make, granny squares. A lot of people's origin story involves granny squares, but you know, there are some places that we all fell down or still fall down when producing them. And then of course there are an unbelievable range of beautiful blankets that are built in rows with various stitches. I've been looking at bean stitch recently. I'm going to make a bean stitch blanket. I think it might take a year, but it's going to be worth it. So I'm going to share my do's first. Let's start on a high, and then the don'ts to bring you crashing down to earth at the end of it. Hopefully not. It's going to be fine. They've got positive undertones too. So let's start with those all important do's of crocheting blankets. We're going to dive right from the beginning of the process. Hopefully this isn't overly controversial. However, I believe confidently that it's a very useful thing, especially for beginners. If you're making a crochet blanket with rows, make that starting chain with a slightly bigger hook size. So that's 1/2 mil or 1 mil bigger than the size that you're going to use to make the rest of the pattern. People's tension tends to start off quite tightly with chains. If you're a loose chainer, don't follow that advice. But if you're a tense starting chainer and it's going to have tighter stitches and it's going to cause this sort of buckling bowing at the beginning of your blanket, just up that hook size before you begin. Again, before you start or as you've just started, write down the size of hook that you are using to make that blanket. Ideally, take a stitch marker or a safety pin and a teeny bit of paper and tack it onto your work just after you've started. I have got some wasted projects where I have done quite a lot of rows on them and I cannot work out what hook I used. Another great way is just to take a photo with your phone of your starting equipment and your first bit of it, and then you won't go wrong later on and end up gutted if you have to have a bit of a break and use the hook for something else. Do the same thing with your yarn. So not just the yarn brand that you use, but what you need for yours is to look at like it's going to be Serda, Snuggly, in Peppermint, dye batch 8,322. This is not a realistic example, but write down all the details, or again, take a photo of it, or just take the cover off your yarn, the little bit of cardboard that goes around it, and put that with your work in a Ziploc bag, or attach it to it if it's small or your work is big, so you don't forget and get confused later on. Plan your colours ahead of time. Now, if you're doing like a scrappy yarn scrap blanket or one that is styled in order to be random, then don't worry too much. However, I strongly suspect that quite a few of these that you see beautiful photos of on Instagram that I quickly smash heart button for, they did actually plan with their scraps and laid them out and they did them in a particular order. Colour matching feels frustrating if you just want to get going. It's actually one of my favourite parts of the process. But take the yarns that you think might be suitable for the project, splash them all over your desk or the floor, muddle them together and see which ones look good. It will make so much of a difference to how that finished project looks. Count your stitches if it's looking wonky. I know if you had a starting chain of 152, that's going to be a little bit frustrating. But if you're a few rows in and it's looking uneven, it is probably that you've lost your stitch numbers somewhere. And counting, you often find once you start counting that you can see where you've made the mistake, but it will also tell you if an increase or decrease in the total number of stitches in the row is the reason you're going wonky, and then you can sort that and work out where you went wrong. Weave in your ends as you go. Unless you're someone who loves weaving them in at the end, and I've got to tell you, even though you're going to partially weave them in as you go, still leave longer ends out of that to do further weaving later on, but it will just save you a lot of work. And also I find that I feel happier with what I'm creating if it looks a little bit neater whilst I'm making it up. I don't know if you're the same. Make a border. You don't have to make a border, but I love a border, and it is a wonderful way to feel that the project's complete, and it's a great way to hide loose ends and to neaten everything together. So if you've got this amazing blanket that's 200 rows long and on one of them you had to do your recount and you had to do an increase or a decrease to make it back together. A border can just neaten everything up in a way that hand repairs never really can to that extent. Borders are great. I love borders. Do consider using borders. Do sew your ends rather than just hooking them in. So obviously crochet as you go, that's brilliant, and your hook can be really useful, especially for sort of thicker fibres, but sewing them in I just find is a more long-term effective way to hide those yarn ends. Do watch your tension. It happens to the best of us. When you've been crocheting for a long time, you'll find that your tension is quite consistent. My tension is really consistent now, but if you're watching something on the television and something scary or upsetting happens and you tense, your tension's gonna tense. If someone asks you a stressful question, or if you just get into a really relaxed sort of zen state, do you do that? Tell me how that feels. I want to feel that. I hear it's a thing. I wish it was a thing for me. But still, super relaxed, tension will relax. Tense about something, tension will tighten. So just keep an eye, and you can do this visually. You can look at your work, and also when you feel along your rows, you'll be able to feel if the tension is inconsistent. It will feel different between your fingers as you grip it. Do store your work carefully. This is so especially true for granny squares, which because they're smaller, I tend to just like throw them into a bag or push them under the sofa, and that's not a good idea. That's gonna cause things to be not as beautiful in the longer term, and that's how you lose stuff. Do store your work carefully. And finally, do block. I am a blocking avoider. I predominantly these days make crochet toys, so blocking doesn't come into my life that much. So I think it has more of a novelty value now. So I'm better at doing it now, but do block. And you don't need a blocking board to block. You can block to an extent by putting heavy books on top of things. I use the big book of snakes. So it's a big book, there's a lot of snakes. And I put it on top of my crochet squares and it flattens them out. Give them a tiny spray first to make them a little bit damp, and it will make all the difference to how your squares look once you join them together. Now, the don'ts. There are fewer don'ts than do's. Don't worry. Don't rush. I give this advice whenever I give advice about anything to do with crochet. You get questioned a lot when you do this hobby for a long time about how people can do things quicker and more efficiently. And I get that. I get that as a question, and I like to do a thing when I want to do it. But don't rush. Rushing is when we make mistakes, and it also makes it less fun. And it can interfere with your enjoyment of the process. So especially if you're new, don't rush. Slow and steady. Don't buy the yarn as you go. Heartbreaking for me. I overheard conversation in the yarn store the other day by a girl who had bought her first skeins to make her blanket that she was making up, and she'd used up that yarn, and she was coming in to get the next one, and they didn't stock it anymore. And it wasn't even just that they didn't have the same dye lot, they didn't stock that yarn anymore, and it had put her in this horrible situation where she wanted to continue the way she'd begun, but she couldn't. If you plan ahead how much yarn you're going to need, and okay, there are always situations where inevitably, you know, you run out quicker because your tension's a bit looser than the person who wrote the pattern, that sort of thing. But do try to buy all the ingredients for your crochet blanket recipe before you start cooking it. Don't be afraid to combine styles. There are loads of wonderful ways of crocheting blankets, from incredibly modern, bright and bold to intricate traditional designs. And sometimes when you merge styles, you can come up with something really gorgeous. Don't use a yarn texture that is not comfortable. I'm fussy about texture. This is not a secret. I'm fussy about textures of everything in my life, from things that I touch to things that I wear to things that I eat. Textures is a whole thing. But if textures is a thing for you, this is a really important don't. If you pick up that yarn in the store, or you start making your first granny square and you don't like the squeaky sound it makes, or the rough feel on your skin, or the too smooth feel on your skin, if that's not your thing, stop using that yarn, because you will only abandon the project partway through. Blankets are big, they take us a while. You have to like the feel of the yarn you're using. Don't ever, just don't work through pain. If you get a sore shoulder, a sore wrist, I know it's frustrating and we think to ourselves, oh, I can just I'll just finish this bit. Just don't. Mark where you are, write it down if you're following a more complicated pattern, and put it away until the pain is gone. And then maybe start again a different position, consider wrist supports, wraps, that kind of thing. In the long run, you are going to really regret trying to push through pain. If it starts hurting, you stop until the pain goes. Chronic pain is a whole different conversation, and I'm terribly sorry if that's a thing that you're dealing with and that's annoying advice, because it doesn't go away. But this is for the people who have got pain that is caused from the activity. Pause the activity and come back to it later. And sometimes we can fix it with things as simple as crocheting in a more sensible place, in a better chair, adjusting our posture and putting our hands in our laps rather than holding them up. All those kind of things. Change something up. Don't work through the pain. Don't go too big. And this is primarily aimed at those beginners and not those of us who bullishly know that we'll get there. Aiming for a project that is too huge in scale or in complexity that's out of our experience level in too many ways, you're never going to make it to the end. You're never going to get that joy of holding that finished thing or wrapping yourself up in it and feeling all snuggly. Try to be realistic about your own expectations on yourself about how big and how complex you can go, and plan accordingly. That said, don't be afraid to store your project and come back to it later. Also, don't be afraid to frog it if it's gone wrong. Unravel it, do something else. I have several crochet blanket projects that are long-term projects for me, particularly a corner-to-corner one that I am completely in love with. But realistically, it's going to be Christmas by the time that it's anywhere near done. It is my zoning out of my brain and not thinking project, and I love it. I love a corner-to-corner. Have you done a corner-to-corner? I love a corner-to-corner. I repeatedly work on it somewhat, and then I fold it up with all the yarns pre-brought to the correct amount, bought, not brought, and I store it. And finally, and this is so important because you have put hours of your life and probably a lot of money into this. Don't share it if you want to keep it. You get to the end of that project and someone's like, oh, that's adorable, I wish it was mine. Yeah, you wish it was yours. It's mine. You keep it. Appreciate your own work. I think as crafters in general and crocheters specifically, we love sharing the things that we've made, right? But then sometimes you can not have as much to show for what you've done. If you are making this for you, when you get to the end, it's yours. Don't forget that. And celebrate what you've done. Sometimes it's not appreciated when you complete something that's insanely big and amazing, like a blanket, by people who don't do a craft. But we appreciate it and we are proud of you and we're impressed. And if it's your first crochet project and you're feeling confused or despondent, chat to us down in the comments below, and we'll be your cheerleaders, because it's a wonderful thing to do. And I can't wait to hear about your crochet blanket projects. And tell me what do's and don'ts I missed. What else would you add to that list? Do you disagree with any of them? Let's have a chat in the comments section, and happy crocheting.